The American pastime, baseball. My two sons have developed an interest in the sport, so I thought it'd be a good idea to buy them a baseball glove and a ball, get them practicing. Turns out, when I went to the sporting goods store, I could not find a single American glove that was made in the United States. So what did I do? Well, the next best thing I could find is an Oriental glove that at least said North American steer hide. That was the closest I could come to supporting my country. When I went to get the ball, every single ball I could find in that store was not made in the United States. And the list goes on. Your shirt, the clothes you wear, this particular sports shirt, made in Hong Kong. The pencil you use, the one I use, very famous manufacturer of American office supplies, said made in China. Your television set, are there any American television sets made? I don't think so.
No.
Wasn't the television invented, in fact, the United States? True. Maybe this is why you are out of work, or a dear friend of yours is out of work. This is also a result of a policy which has been going on for many, many years. I'm Julius Smetona. This is What Catholics Believe. We're going to discuss trade in the New World Order, and we're also going to look at a Catholic perspective on these issues. With me today are the Reverend William Jenkins. Father Jenkins is pastor of St. Teresa of the Child Jesus Church in Parma, Ohio. Father Clarence Kelly from the Society of St. Pius V in Oyster Bay Cove, New York, and a special guest, Mr. William Gill. Mr. Gill is an author, historian, president of American Coalition for Competitive Trade. He was a journalist who, for many years, was a correspondent for UPI, the Pittsburgh Press. He contributed to Life, Time, National Geographic. He's been on Crossfire. It's a pleasure to welcome you, Mr. Gill, Reverend Fathers. Mr. Gill, it's becoming increasingly obvious that more and more manufactured goods are either not made in the United States but have an American label on them, or are outright imports. Do you think there's any correlation between this fact and the severe unemployment we're starting to experience, and the displaced workers and families?
Well, there has been a correlation for about 30 years. Indeed, an industry that I was a consultant to on trade for 14 years, the steel industry, specifically the specialty steel industry of the United States. I started out in 1975 in our first case with 25 companies. They're down now to about 10. Not all of the other 15 companies went out of business, although most of them did. But we have 650,000 steel workers in the United States about 30 years ago, before the import invasion began in earnest. We're down now to about 150,000. We've lost 500,000 jobs in that one industry alone. And you have to multiply those direct steel jobs, the jobs in direct steel making, by the support industries and the community infrastructure jobs that have been lost, too. And the Labor Department for years told us that the multiplier was 1.5, which would have meant that we only had lost 1.25 million jobs in steel. However, as I cite in my book, Trade Wars Against America, that multiplier has been increased, and it's as much as 3.5 is what they now believe was the true multiplier. So we've lost several million jobs, 2.5 to 3 million jobs in one industry.
What are the specific trade policies that you would attribute these job losses to?
Well, to the trade policy of the United States government under both Republicans and Democrats. It has not made any difference at all over the last 30 years.
And what was this policy?
The policy is to open up our markets as wide as we can, and in fact with the new GATT agreement that will come on track soon, if it's approved by the Congress, it will be wide open. There will be no longer any deterrence at all. They're going to wipe out all tariffs and other barriers to imports into the United States. I can assure you that this is not going to happen in the other countries that are parties to this agreement.
In other words, some of the people who are sending the imports, or some of these countries, at the same time have among the most protected economies in the world, such as Japan.
Now, almost all of them have protected economies, actually.
My question is, if it works for them, why can't it work for us?
Well, it did work for us for 125 years, from the very beginning of the Republic down to the year 1913, when the Wilson administration, which incidentally was the first administration to go for the New World Order, and that's what Wilson called it. The very first action that they took when they came in 1913, the president called a special session of the Congress to do away with the traditional American system, the protective system, which had built this country.
This is going to come as a bit of a revelation to a lot of people, Mr. Gill, in that they somehow associate unrestricted, open trade as being very, very American, and anything that would put restrictions or some kind of a fair play control mechanism would be viewed as very untraditional and un-American. But what you're saying is that was the traditional system for the first 125 years of the country. Could you explain?
More than that, it was the system, the government of the United States was brought into being for this very reason. The American Revolution was fought over trade. Taxation without representation was the slogan. But the real reason was trade, because we were shipping our products to Britain to come back as the finished products, you see, our raw materials, just as you did with that baseball mitt that went to Japan as our cowhide and came back as a baseball. Well, exactly the same thing. In fact, we couldn't even print Bibles in the United States. No Bibles were permitted. They had to be imported from England. The exceptions were the German Bibles for the Pennsylvania Germans, and one English Bible, or rather in a phonetic Indian language that Jonathan Edwards in the Massachusetts frontier, the theologian, the Puritan theologian, had translated. That was the only exceptions. All of the other, there were some bootleg Bibles, I must say, but all of the others had to be printed and imported from England.
If I could name some American figures in the past who were very strong on protecting our trade rights and keeping imports to minimum: Alexander Hamilton, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln. They imposed, and I guess, you know, if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. How are you going to develop an industry in this country if someone else can produce something, and very often a foreign government, not a foreign company, can produce something at a much lower cost? Or maybe they can't produce it, but they can subsidize it to keep you from developing yours. I mean, it makes sense. Father Kelly, is there a Catholic view on trade?
Well, there is, but I think that we should probably underline a couple of times what Mr. Gill said, because it is a revelation to a lot of people. There are a lot of people out there who are basically good and decent people who are confused. And the reason they're confused is because here you have someone like, you know, a liberal like President Clinton promoting free trade, and alongside President Clinton you have the Republicans promoting free trade, and you even have, say, for example, the most influential and powerful talk show host in the United States, Rush Limbaugh, promoting the free trade agreement. And people out there are confused. They really don't know what to think. They don't know, well, what really is the traditional American view of this? And that's why I think what Mr. Gill says is extremely important. Right. You know, for people out there to know and to understand that the American way is what Mr. Gill said. The American way is not free trade. Free trade is a flag which attracts people who are in favor of freedom, because they think free trade means freedom. Right. So I think that's extremely important, Mr. Gill, and I think that that's a very, very significant thing, and it will be enlightenment for the people, because people really are confused. They don't know, they don't understand. And it just so happens that what Mr. Gill said and what was the traditional policy in the United States coincides with the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas. Well, St. Thomas Aquinas established the philosophical basis for this very point, and he did it in a very profound way. He did it by saying that the higher a being is, the more independent it is. And that would apply to a moral person, for example, like the state, or to a country. So that if you have a country that is very independent and does not have to rely upon others, that is something which fortifies and strengthens the sovereignty of that nation. And that is the reason why the traditional view is to foster free trade, let's say, for example, within the country, but not the so-called free trade with foreign governments, because it tends to undermine the sovereignty of the nation. And of course, that's what this is really all about.
You know, one of the things with Reverend Fathers and Mr. Gill, which St. Thomas underscores, is this. His principle, as I understand it, is one of national self-sufficiency. And he says that if you begin trading with a country or become economically involved more than you absolutely have to, your lifestyle and your way of life will be influenced by theirs. For instance, if you start trading with China and they can pay their workers slave labor wages of 15 cents an hour, what are you going to have to do in order to be competitive? You're going to have to cut wages, and already we're seeing this in Europe, where they have very well-treated workers with 6 weeks vacation, 35-hour work weeks. In Germany, they even buy them First Communion dresses as a fringe benefit and so forth. And their workforce is considered to be not competitive anymore. And of course, this is what flows. But Father Jenkins, on this question, when you see these kind of results where you think about one of the four capital sins, or rather one of the four sins that cry to heaven for vengeance, defrauding a worker of his just wages, what does St. Thomas Aquinas say to those who are promoting this kind of policy?
Well, actually, Julius, I wanted to respond to something that was said earlier by our guests here. What Father Kelly said, the danger of being dependent is very important in this whole controversy, because what we see happening here through NAFTA and GATT and other trade agreements that are happening on the national and international level is the progressively making America dependent. The whole New World Order depends upon interdependence, and so all the nations of the world have to be made dependent. There are many nations in the world that are dependent, but the nations that are not have to be made dependent. And so America is being made dependent artificially so that she'll fit into the New World Order. You know, in the Old Testament, the Jews were severely restricted by God in their relations with the pagan nations around them. They were restricted in many, many ways. One of those was by trade and the dealing of goods, you know, exchange of goods, precisely because God warned them that due to their interaction in economies, there would be an influence of these pagan cultures on the culture of the Jews. And God punished them. In fact, when they moved into the Promised Land, God ordered them that when they conquered a pagan people who was there before them, they would have to destroy not only you know, whoever came out to oppose them, but they would have to destroy their livestock, they would have to destroy their goods, and if they kept any vestige of these things, they would be severely punished for it, just to eradicate the influence of paganism.
Well, I got a question for Mr. Gill, right? And my question is this. There's all this talk about the New World Order and all this talk about free trade, and it's all going on at the same time. Obviously, there's a connection between the one and the other. Do you think that the people who are promoting these things are consciously doing it for that purpose? Are they promoting free trade in order to actually bring about this world government?
As a matter of fact, we've had several newsletters on that. I treat on it in my book. But what I've said in one of the newsletters is that free trade is both is the cutting edge of the New World Order. It's the thing that's creating the New World Order, but it's also the be-all and end-all of the New World Order. In other words, the New World Order will only finally be in place when you have total free trade. You have wiped out the sovereignty of all the nations, you see. You have erased the borders. And at that point, the millennium, I suppose, will come to pass, and there'll be total chaos rather than just partial chaos as there is today.
You're watching What Catholics Believe. We're discussing trade. Mr. Gill, this is known perhaps to some people who've directly experienced it. Others don't know it that well. Could you perhaps outline, say, the destruction of a given industry by these so-called free trade policies? In your book, you mentioned the television industry. Again, television was invented here. Video recorders were invented here. None of them are made here anymore. How did this come to pass?
Well, I'm intimately familiar with that. I cite, I guess, 3 or 4 of the industries that I was involved with. And one of them is the television, or was the television manufacturing industry. They were my client for a number of years. Actually, Corning Glass, because Corning Glass invented the glass parts for television sets in cooperation with the research that was going on, but with RCA, who got most of the patents on television manufacturing. And at that time, in the early 70s, Corning Glass had something like 5 plants, mostly in the Midwest, making glass parts, some of them with several thousand more workers, Michigan and Indiana and so on. They now are down to, when I last looked, 1, which is about a half of 1. So all those other plants are closed. But so are dozens of other television manufacturing plants, see where they put the components together, all of them out of business. Or if not out of business, the labels survive. Zenith is now producing them in Mexico and other countries. They were the last holdout, incidentally. I don't want to take you through all of this, but this was one of the great betrayals. A man named Robert Strauss, if that's a familiar name, he was last the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union under George Bush. Robert Strauss was the president's trade representative in the Carter administration, and his priority, immediately as he was confirmed by the Senate, was to get on a plane, fly to Tokyo to solve the case that we had brought television manufacturing industry. We were calling ourselves COMPACT, the Committee to Preserve American Color Television. They were trying to make this announcement in London at an economic summit meeting. So the pressure was on to get an agreement. We didn't know it until afterwards, and I must say I was the one who discovered it. I was sitting between 2 of our lawyers at the President Trade Representative Office in Washington when they unveiled this monstrosity. That they cut them back temporarily from the 55% penetration of our market to 25% allegedly for a 3-year period. Immediately, the Japanese went around our left end and our right end, Korea, Taiwan. That's where they put the plants, in other words, to avoid the agreements. I mean, they do anything to avoid the agreements. They never keep their agreements. But what I discovered was that Strauss had made a secret agreement with the Japanese to wipe out what turned out to be almost $1 billion in dumping duties that were owed to the U.S. Treasury, $850 million at that particular time. All right? Wasn't going to announce this, of course. This was a secret agreement. And that's what wiped out the American color television industry.
Well, yeah, I remember
was that secret agreement. Because if those duties had been collected, and incidentally, the Commissioner of Customs had sent out telegrams to collect the duties. And the Japanese ambassador came down to the White House, Carter's White House, and got that canceled, got the collection of those duties canceled. And they settled for about 5 cents on the dollar. How would you like to get your tax bill cut down to 5 cents on the dollar? Well, that's what the Japanese did. And that was the death knell, really, of the American television manufacturing industry, which, incidentally, was practically all of what we had left in the consumer electronics industry in this country, because all the other things, tape recorders and so on, had already gone.
Why did that affect the television industry so much?
Television manufacturing
The
industry?
failure to collect the duties.
Well, the failure to collect duties meant that the Japanese could just go on with impunity to dump their television sets in the United States.
Could you explain
At a
dumping?
lower
what
price.
that
Yeah, let
means?
me explain dumping, because it's a misunderstood term. People think it's selling at a lower price, as you say, Father, but below the cost of production. It's not that. It's when you dump, dumping is created by selling below what the fair market value is in the country of origin. In this case, it was Japan. And they were selling television sets for $600, $800, $900 on the Ginza in Tokyo that they were selling in Sears Roebuck for $250 or $300. Right. Now, what they did in that case with Sears Roebuck, I must tell you, and these were court cases, I cite them in the book, they went up, and they sweetened the pill for Sears Roebuck by sending him, I'll use hypothetical cases, a shipload of roller skates or something, you see, free, to make up a little bit for this. There were all kinds of totally illegal criminal practices going on.
There's financial kickbacks.
There were kickbacks. I cite that. Time
right.
magazine, who I've written for too, also had the
They would
story
make
on
up,
kickbacks.
they would tell Sears to sell it at $200 when the fair market value in Japan was $750, and they'd reimburse Sears the $550. Now, how can anyone say this is a good policy to allow this to happen?
From a political point of view, though, in other words, we'll say like Carter doing something like that, or Clinton doing these things, they would be doing it then in order to promote this new arrangement in the world, this interdependence and the decrease in American sovereignty. I mean, that's really what is behind it then.
This, I believe, is what both Carter and certainly Clinton and Bush, too, were all doing. I don't think that Reagan was consciously doing that. He may have been unconsciously doing that, you see. They know what they're doing. Clinton knows what he's doing in this case. He is trying to be the president that's going to put the cap on the New World Order. He's the descendant, the lineal descendant of Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt, you see. To a lesser extent, Carter. He wouldn't want to acknowledge that too flagrantly or openly. But yes, you're right. Now, the people who really know and who are the ones that are pulling the string on the puppets, like Carter, like Clinton, are people like David Rockefeller, who is, to a degree, in my view, a puppet himself, without knowing it. And these people, the international banking community, they are the ones who, incidentally, came up with NAFTA. They invented the NAFTA treaty. Why? In order to recover the well over $100 billion that was owed to them, but owed to our big banks, by the Mexicans. They went into de facto default in 1981. And they haven't paid interest. In many cases, they had to give them loans to pay the interest, I see. So now they're not only going to be able to collect the interest and collect, hopefully, some of the principal on their loans by trading our jobs, our industries, that they know are going to be exported to Mexico, all right, in order for them to recover their losses, billions and billions of dollars in losses, which they've already written off, but they're also going to have banking privileges in Mexico and eventually in all of Latin America when the Hemispheric Trade Treaty, which is already coming into being, incidentally. The Central American states, Guatemala and 4 others, have already signed a free trade agreement that plugs them or will plug them into the NAFTA. Right. Another group of nations, Venezuela, Colombia, and Brazil, I believe it was, the other day, signed another agreement in preparation for the creation of this big Latin American. See, we're going to be plugged in.
We have like 2 minutes left, and here's one question to wrap up. Could you tell us the human cost of some of these policies?
Oh, yes. The human cost is, well, it's really incalculable, because we have had millions of American families that have been wiped out financially, but more than just financially, families broken up, children lost forever. The street people out there are the most obvious evidence of a good bit of this policy.
You've been watching What Catholics Believe.